This is my peanut butter and fried banana cake. It was an experiment. I'll tell you some of the adjustments that I will make next time I try this and why. So the first thing that I'm doing in a small or medium-sized bowl, I'm whisking my dry ingredients. That's 1 2/3 of a cup of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, half of a teaspoon of baking soda, 3 tablespoons of cornstarch, and half of a teaspoon of salt. And that's if I'm using salted butter. If I'm not using salted butter, I'll probably bump that up to 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. Whisking those ingredients, make sure that everything is evenly mixed. It makes sure we don't have any clumps of anything, especially like the baking soda or the flour. And then it also makes sure to aerate those dry ingredients. You can also achieve the same effect with if you use a sifter. Air, in this case, becomes a leavening ingredient to lighten up our cake. Anytime that you intend to frost a cake, you should not use a cake recipe that only calls for butter. That will make for a hard cake. You should use strictly oil in a recipe or half and half. So I'm using 1/3 of a cup of oil. It can be canola or vegetable, and 1/3 of a cup of butter. That would be 1/3 of a cup of butter is the same as 5 tablespoons and 1 teaspoon of butter. 5 1/3 tablespoons. Now I'm adding my sugar. It's equal parts of white sugar and brown sugar. 1/3 cup of white sugar went in, and I started to cream that. And then I'm now going in with 1/3 of a cup of packed brown sugar. Now I used mostly light brown sugar, but I ran out of light brown sugar, and so there at the top you can see there was about a tablespoon worth of dark brown sugar. And now I kind of wish that I had used maybe a little more dark brown sugar. We will see. That won't be the first change that I make the next time I try this, though. Okay, so in goes the light and dark brown sugar. We will cream all of this very well. We're going to try to get this little light and fluffy. Creamed butter and sugar, when it's really properly mixed, this is another aspect of the cake that adds aeration and allows our cake to rise better. There were a couple of things about this cake that I wasn't happy with, and I'll tell you what those were as we go, but the lightness and airiness was not one of them. This cake came out perfectly, just light. It was not heavy or dense. So don't skip this step. And I'm not going to skip past this step just because I want you to get an idea of how long you really do need to do this. I feel like most people just show little clips. And I know for myself, when I was learning how to cook things, if I watched a video on it, I didn't really have a sense of time. All right, in goes our peanut butter. So I'm using a 1/3 cup measurement. And by the way, this is the same cup that I used to measure out the oil. We will need a total of 2/3 of a cup. So you can just use the 1/3 of a cup once and blend that in, and then use the second third of a cup of peanut butter and add that in. And when you use the same third cup measurement cup that you used for the oil, it'll make the peanut butter really easy to come out and really easy to clean. It won't get stuck to the cup. Okay, now I'm going in with, after the peanut butter in 2 separate additions was perfectly mixed, I added 1 egg. That was, of course, at room temperature. All of these ingredients were at room temperature. They were left out since early in the morning to come to room temperature. And then I put in 2 other eggs, one by one, after each egg had been well incorporated. Now I added about, it's up to you, a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half of vanilla extract. It can be fake, that's just fine. The last of my wet ingredients, I'm adding 1 cup of buttermilk. Now, as I said, this cake was a complete experiment. I don't want to, at this point, you can overbeat wet ingredients when there's eggs in them, but it's not nearly as bad as overmixing once you get those dry ingredients in. So, feel free to stop your mixer, scrape down the sides, and just really get those wet ingredients perfectly incorporated. Now you can start to add your dry bowl ingredients to the wet bowl. I folded the flour mix in 3 separate additions. Don't use your whisk for this, it'll overmix. And as you watch me fold this, I'll tell you what I probably would have done differently. This cake, to my liking, wasn't quite sweet enough, but it definitely was not peanut butter flavor forward enough for me. So I would probably add up to an additional third of a cup of peanut butter, or I would have added probably an additional, maybe even up to a quarter of a cup of dark brown sugar, just because that molassesy flavor would have made the existing peanut butter flavor shine more. So those are 2 out of the 3 things that I would have done differently with this cake. If I make it again, I will. Okay, so these are 2 9-inch springform pans. I try to develop all of my recipes for 9-inch springform pans because these are my 2 favorite pans. I definitely get a lot of use out of them. I buttered the sides, and this is a perfectly buttered and floured cake pan. Butter and flour them so that your cakes won't stick. They'll release perfectly. Make sure that you do that, and obviously make sure that your oven was well preheated, like for a good 30-40 minutes before your dry ingredients go into your wet, because once that baking powder and baking soda hit the wet ingredients, they will start to activate, and they will need to go into the oven like immediately. If you ever have a recipe that calls for more cake layers than you have pans that can fit in the oven, I recommend you find a different recipe. That's what I do, because they'll tell you in a recipe, oh, you can put the first 2 cake pans in the oven, let those cook, and then put the remaining 1 or 2 cake pans, or remaining 1 cake pan in the oven to cook the second batch. That second batch, that final pan, will not cook as well. It won't rise as nicely. One of the best investments that you can make as a home cook is to buy a scale. I am pretty good at eyeballing this. These 2 layers came out almost like identical, but you really want to make sure that your layers are as identical as possible because they bake more evenly. So you won't have one that's more underbaked and one that's overbaked. Those 2 tins went into the oven for 30 minutes at 350 degrees, and I washed whatever I could wash, and then I sprayed my sink down with Dawn Power Wash, because obviously we don't want to leave a mess, and we're going to get started on some frosting. Now the frosting is the one thing that I would make a change with again. I'll talk to you about that. Let's talk about our banana filling and topping. Now that the cakes have come out of the oven and I allowed them to cool in the pan for about 7 minutes, and then I carefully removed them and put them on a wire rack to cool, we're going to use a total of 5 bananas for this. Now the banana part, I should say, I was satisfied with. So I cut up 3 bananas to start. I used a tablespoon of butter. I used about, what is that? Probably the equivalent of 3 teaspoons of brown sugar that is not packed, just scooped out, 3 heaping teaspoons of, I think I used dark brown sugar because that's all that I had left. I used a good couple shakes of cinnamon, and I used a splash of vanilla and a healthy splash of banana extract. Be careful if you choose to do this in a non-stick skillet like this that has a dark bottom, because if your sugar starts to burn, you won't be able to see it as well. It's probably best to do this in something that has a lighter colored bottom, but I feel pretty confident in my ability that I won't burn this. Best to keep this on something between low and medium heat, closer to low, and just give your bananas a chance to kind of pan fry and soak up this sugar syrup. I did cut these into thicker chunks because I want these chunks to top the cake and I don't want them to fall apart. So this was them after a good 5 minutes at a low heat. Now the second batch of bananas, I did the exact same thing, a tablespoon of butter, sprinkle of sugar, a little cinnamon, vanilla, banana. Obviously, you can see I cut these significantly thinner, and that's because these are going to go in between the two layers of cake, and then they're going to get mashed. Okay, and I'm putting down my first cake layer. It's always important anytime you have a filling layer that you use your frosting to kind of create a barrier or like a moat to hold in the filling. Otherwise, the filling is going to come out of the sides. So as you see, I used my squeeze bottle with a frosting tip and I just squeezed around the side. The heavier second layer is going to press down on that filling and frosting and press it out anyway. I left that in the fridge to chill for like 30-45 minutes. Then I put my frosting on and then I put my bananas on top of that. Now, this frosting was also an experiment. You know what? I don't think I'm going to do an experiment with a cake and a frosting ever again. I was very ambitious. One of the challenges that I have with frosting is that we all know American buttercream frosting can be way too sweet. The reason that American buttercream gets more stiff as you add confectioner sugar to it, which is an ingredient that would normally liquefy because sugar is liquid. It's hygroscopic. It turns wet. Um, is that there's so much butter in your standard American buttercream that it envelopes that sugar and prevents it from liquefying. And people just add more and more and more confectioner sugar just to get a stiffer, more pipeable and decoratable frosting. I don't want something that is that teeth-shatteringly sweet. That's why I think a lot of people probably hate Walmart cakes. The frost that's all, as far as I'm aware. I don't know, I could be wrong. That's all that Walmart does is like American buttercream. And I like other kinds of frosting. So this was an experimental frosting. It weeped a little bit, and you may have seen that with the stars or like the Hershey kiss shape, the kisses that I piped on top of the cake. It was still good. It was definitely not too sweet. Maybe even it could have been sweeter. Um, but I think the next time that I make this, I will make it with a cream cheese frosting that has a little banana flavor added to it. So there are my three changes. I would probably add, um, I would either add an additional third of a cup of peanut butter to this cake, or I might just add all dark brown sugar instead of light brown sugar. Um, or I might add an additional, at least like two tablespoons of the dark brown sugar. And then I would use a banana extract flavored cream cheese frosting as opposed to the frosting that I was experimenting with. I also think a whipped cream frosting or a Swiss meringue frosting probably would have gone really nicely with this. Thank you for being my guinea pig, and I may give this one a shot again later, probably not anytime soon. Bye.